I can't even really overstate how much this bothers me. We are seeing not just almost a daily drumbeat of these pro-Hamas, so-called pro-Palestine protests in various cities around the country, and we've, of course, talked about it on campus as well. I think that's bad enough, right? I think that to have people, as they did, rushing out on October 8th to effectively celebrate what happened to innocent people getting murdered by terrorists, and they've changed their justifications and their talking points and their demands along the way, but there's something extremely ugly and in some cases evil at the core of this movement. And because they have basically gotten away with their escalations, they've become emboldened. Also, they are hardcore leftists for the most part, and they can't help themselves. They have to be as obnoxious, as off-putting as possible. I think one of the best things about the hardcore left is how obnoxious and annoying and alienating they are. God forbid they ever became a little bit more savvy and less obnoxious and annoying. They might actually do more damage. Because average people look at so many of their tactics and their rhetoric and their slogans and just the way that they present themselves to the world, and they say, yeah, that's not for me. Case in point, this goes beyond just a superficial complaint, but case in point is this decision that they've made to go the direction of the zero oil, greenie left-wingers, and again, there's just massive overlap in all of these radical groups, to block traffic and to desecrate various locations. Let me start with the latter of those two examples. You might recall that last year, the Free Gaza crowd, the Hamas apologists, defaced the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington, D.C. You might recall that they also defaced the White House gate and splashed it with red blood and a bunch of red paint handprints representing blood on your hands. Of course, they're not doing this in protest of Hamas, the genocidal maniac murderers. They're doing this as apparently a moral indictment of the Biden administration, for the most part, taking Israel's side as Israel defends itself. Just totally morally backwards, as usual. But this is criminal activity. Remember when the Tea Party would gather? If a single person had a sign that said something offensive or potentially problematic, or if someone threw even like a tiny bit of garbage on the ground, as the media is like, look at this out-of-control mob, dangerous. Nancy Pelosi got all fake teary-eyed about how scary it all was. I mean, absurd, given what we witnessed, for example, from the BLM rioters in 2020 and now this crew. But they're committing crimes. The latest example of the defacement, the desecration, just the other day in Los Angeles, pro-Palestinian protesters, as that's what we want to even call them, the Hamas crowd, they went to a U.S. military cemetery in California and vandalized it. This is a place where 85,000 American soldiers are buried. It is the final resting place of tens of thousands of American heroes, including some people decorated at the very highest levels for their valor, for their bravery, for their service. National Review writes it this way: pro-Palestinian protesters defaced the Los Angeles National Cemetery on Sunday. So this was just 2 days ago. It's a national burial space where more than 80,000 veterans of World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and more are laid to rest. Protesters spray-painted Free Gaza on the entrance to the memorial and chanted, "Long live Palestine, there is only one solution." What do you think that means? And, of course, from the river to the sea. Hundreds of protesters held signs that read "Ceasefire now," "Stop bombing Gaza," and the occupation. Of course, there was no occupation of Gaza, and this is what happened anyway. One sign read "Zionist equals Nazi," The protest also shut down Wilshire Boulevard. So they shut down a street while they were at it as well. It wasn't just enough to deface a military cemetery. They also had to block traffic. 14 Medal of Honor recipients are buried at this cemetery, as are more than 100 Buffalo soldiers, the African-American soldiers who served in black regiments during westward expansion in the 1800s. The story points out that under California law, it is illegal to do this sort of thing. The law forbids the effacement of any tomb, monument, memorial, or marker in a cemetery. It is punishable by imprisonment. Of course, no one was imprisoned for this. So I just want to make it perfectly clear. I think these people are the absolute dregs of society. They celebrate the murder of Jews. They celebrate a terrorist organization. At the very best, they are useful, ignorant idiots on behalf of that terrorist organization. And to make their point, so to speak, they spray paint slogans all over a military cemetery, on the Lincoln Memorial, at the White House, and they block traffic. I mean, it is just a repulsive group of people on behalf of a repugnant cause. And naturally, a lot of them are also bigots, just anti-Semites. It's a motley crew of anti-Semites, Islamist extremists, hardcore leftists, communists, and that I think that mostly covers it. All right, and they're weirdly allied into this so-called protest movement. This is how they derive meaning in their lives. And while some of them hate Jews, and while many of them hate Israel, I think it's important to recognize that one of the common denominators here, maybe the tie that binds most strongly, is a hatred of the West and particularly the United States of America. They hate Israel, and they hate us, and they hate Western civilization. And they couldn't be any clearer about it. Now, on this issue of blocking traffic, I have more to say here. The New York Times had a story, a ridiculous story, that was published yesterday, because they're doing this all the time. They just did it in Los Angeles, I told you. They shut down, I think it was I-5 in Seattle the other day. For our KTTH listeners, I'm sure there were some people deeply inconvenienced by that. I guess a lot of those folks were allowed to just go without being arrested. Of course, it's a crime to do this. You can't do it. And yet, because they are in a protected class, apparently, on the hard left, they feel like they can kind of do whatever they want with minimal repercussion, if any. All right, if you're a pro-life demonstrator, a pro-life protester, and it's determined that you are too close to an abortion clinic and you're blocking access, therefore, boy, the weight of the world comes crashing down on your head from the FBI and whoever else. But if you are blocking traffic for hours and all of the problems that causes, safety concerns, people unable to get to work, people unable to get home to their children, the list goes on. Well, it's just a protest. It's just a pro-terrorism protest. What can you do? This is why people talk about the two tiers of justice. Exactly this. It drives them crazy. It drives me crazy. So the latest example was yesterday in New York City. Fortunately, I got out of there because they weren't blocking the exit that I was leaving the city from, but they were blocking off bridges and tunnels. Same people that were shutting down the entrances to airports in New York City recently. So this is the Holland Tunnel, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge. During rush hour, disrupting traffic patterns, sitting in the middle of the street, and it took like an hour and a half to clear it. New York Times wrote a whole story about it. It's amazing. In the entire piece, and I wrote about this today at townhall.com. You can find it. I linked to it. In the entire New York Times story about this criminal behavior by the so-called pro-Palestine terrorism apologists, the only people quoted are participants in the so-called protests and their supporters. There's not a single quote from anyone who's pissed off about having to sit in rush hour traffic for hours because of these people. Not a single quote from a public official saying this is unacceptable. Not a man on the street saying, wow, I don't like that. If they want to make their point, this isn't the way to do it. Not any of that. It's just one quote after another from the good guys, the people blocking the traffic on behalf of Hamas. It's amazing. You know who is quoted in addition to the protesters? Hamas itself. Hamas is cited credulously in this New York Times piece in a death toll citation, which they attribute, of course, to the Gaza Health Ministry, which I guess the New York Times needs to be reminded again is Hamas. I'm not saying that there have not been casualties in Gaza. Many of them are Hamas militants and terrorists. There are some innocent people, unfortunately, too many who have been killed because of Hamas. Hamas put them in harm's way. They made them human shields to be killed. And they've said publicly they like sacrificing their people for the cause. But in terms of actual numbers, whenever you see someone attributing numbers to the Gaza Health Ministry, that is just Hamas. It's propaganda. That made it into the New York Times story. But nothing about all the people who needed to get to work or needed to get home or needed to get anywhere. What if someone was experiencing, for example, a health problem? What if someone's kids had no child care and they desperately had to get to them? It is dangerous to allow this type of behavior to continue with minimal repercussion. And then to add to the boiling of my blood, I saw this clip last night where the protesters who actually were arrested in New York City, they arrested them. New York NYPD, the cops did their job. But because of the way that they don't enforce the law in that city, they were all released. It's like, okay, you'll get a ticket. That's it. So all of these brave traffic blockers, the pro-Hamas traffic blockers, they were let out of jail just a few hours later with no real lasting consequences for their behavior. And they had a crowd of their fellow travelers cheering as they were released. They were exulting in the moment. Cut 24, here it is. Yeah, there's cheering these heroes as they get out with the tiniest, lightest tap on the wrist imaginable. They're cheering because they won. And they're cheering because they're going to do it again. And they're going to keep doing it. Expect a lot more of this because it's being incentivized by people in charge. And mark my words, at some point there is going to be violence or there's going to be physical health harm, whether because of an emergency where people can't get through or because someone is going to snap and take the law into their own hands. We've seen violence where people drag the protesters even by their hair off the street so they can drive wherever they have to go. That is what happens when authorities just capitulate to this, where they give up their responsibility and allow this kind of thing and tolerate it. It's a disgrace. You have to throw the book at these people. Prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. Make the laws tougher. You cannot allow this to go on. And by the way, if it's against the law and punishable by prison to desecrate a military cemetery, then enforce that law because that is infuriating to most Americans. These are the actions, these are the faces, this is the behavior of the pro-Palestine movement in the United States of America and in the West. I think I speak for many of us here when I say I want absolutely nothing to do with them, and it is an honor to oppose them every step of the way.